Good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for the energy. It's helping me. If it's all right, I want to start us off with, before I start this conversation off, talking about our history. First, I want to honor the Emanuel 9. I want us to call the names of those who have gone before us. We want to do this just to open up a space of remembrance. The Honorable Reverend Clementa Pigney, Reverend Daniel Lee Simmons, Sr., Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Cynthia Graham Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lee Lance, Reverend DePayne Middleton Doctor, Tawanza Sanders, and Myra Thompson. So for those who study and love the Black church, we understand that you cannot tell the story of African American history without first telling the story of our churches. They have been our schools, our political arenas, our organizing spaces, our sanctuaries, and sometimes our only refuge. And yet, as this book reminds us, sacred spaces have also been our targets. Kevin, Mr. Kevin, I want to thank you for doing the work of telling this story with such depth and care. I'm honored to be in this conversation with you. I've been listening to my Audible subscription every week. As I go to class, I got this all sticky noted up. I am just so honored and excited to do this conversation. And for this conversation, I like to begin at the beginning. So, you've written about race in the South for decades. Why Mother Emanuel? What was it about this congregation that felt worthy of a 200-year arc rather than just a book about the massacre?
Great first question, Wallace. Can y'all hear me? Okay, let me take this. Well, first of all, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's such a delight for an author to travel this far away from home and see that people are interested in what I'm doing. So I want to particularly thank the library, Christine Peel and Megan Summers. Thanks again to Source Bookshop and Allison, and thank you, Wallace, for taking the time and putting so much effort into this. For those of you who may have noticed the age difference between the two of us, just try to concentrate on the fact that our average age is 46. 43. And he and I also, we've got, I hope this conversation goes okay, because there's tension between us. Because I'm a Duke University graduate, and this man from the University of Michigan. We got a little basketball game going on this afternoon, so Why this church? Why this book? When this happened that very night, June 17th, 2015, I was at home, which at the time was in Atlanta. I was watching TV, CNN, as the first reports came over in real time, and I had never heard of the church. I'm a little embarrassed to say now, despite the fact that I had spent a lot of years reporting about the South and a lot of time in Charleston. I had never heard the name, and I started Googling it, and I was just fascinated by the little skeletal snippets of history that popped up on my screen. That this was the oldest AME church in the South, and as I would find out, not just once, but twice, that it had been formed in 1817, 1818, in this almost unthinkable act of subversion, much like the formation of Mother Bethel in Philadelphia, in which there was a walkout by African American Methodists from white-controlled Methodist churches. Most of the folks who walked out were enslaved. This was just an unbelievable assertion of autonomy in a place like antebellum Charleston. And then that the church had been associated with a plotted slave insurrection that had been discovered before it had a chance to mature, and the church was destroyed as a result. Stayed underground for the better part of 40 or 50 years until after the end of the Civil War. Was revived then, and that the pastor who becomes the founding pastor of the church when it's first named Emanuel in 1865 goes on to become one of the 16 African American Republicans elected to Congress during Reconstruction, that the church was this incredible home to civil rights activism during the 50s and 60s, the people that had spoken there, Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, Dr. King, Coretta Scott King. Anyway, I'm just getting wave after wave of this history and thinking that whatever this crime tonight turns out to be, it's clearly going to be a significant marker in our racial history. But that so much had happened at this place already, the history was so rich. And I really felt a couple of things right off the bat, Wallace, that one, this church shouldn't always be known for its lowest moment, shouldn't only be known for that moment. And I also thought that the rest of America should understand why it mattered so much that this crime had happened in this particular place, that it was not a random selection. And there's still, I think, a lot of open question about how much the shooter knew about the history of the church, but he clearly knew exactly what you were talking about, that the black church was inextricably tied to the freedom movement in this country, and therefore had this symbolism, and really was the symbolism that he was attacking as much as the 9 people who wound up dead on the floor of the fellowship hall. The other thing that started to occur to me was that the story of the church, because it had extended for such a long period of time in a place like Charleston, could be used to tell this broader story of African American life in a place where that story really was critical to tell. I argue in the book that there may be no place in America where the narrative of the African American story is more essential to know than in Charleston. 46% of all enslaved Africans who disembarked in North America did so in the port a few blocks from where I now live. And of course, we all know the Civil War began there. And I also thought that it was valuable because the church's life was so long. So much of our history, not just our African American history, but all of our history, is told through a single person, a single event, a year, a decade, a movement. This story allowed me to show the connectedness of all those dots over time, which I thought was a narrative and historical opportunity that didn't present itself all the time. So for all those reasons, I wanted to tell the story of this place over time and not just the story of what had happened that night.
In your book, you kind of describe Emanuel as a way to tell the story of Black America under one roof. What surprised you the most when you zoomed out to 200 years?
Yeah, I don't know that it was so much that it surprised me, but I think I was continually impressed by the persistence and just the total domination of white supremacist thinking over time. This is not a book that backs away from the notion of institutional racism in this country over the entirety of its history. In fact, I think that's exactly what it documents. And so I think even though we all, through our schooling and our experiences, may know the basic outlines, when you start seeing some of the smaller moments, the pieces of history that we don't know that come out through the story of a place like Emanuel and of a place like South Carolina, it's hard to not be a little bit overwhelmed by how continually and substantially the odds have been stacked against African Americans in this country.
As you were reconstructing the tragedy chapter, did you ever question how much detail was too much, or how did you balance historical truth with reverence for the dead?
Yeah. Well, I certainly wanted to I wanted the book to memorialize them. The book is dedicated to them. I'm thrilled that you started this session today by calling their names. That's so important, and bless you for doing it. But I also thought that it was important while memorializing them to paint them and the church in real terms. I didn't want this to be a hagiography. I wanted it to portray things and people as they actually were, including their imperfections. And so, for instance, the book makes clear in the first chapter that Reverend Pinckney, who was, yes, revered and a remarkable prodigy, this guy was not only the pastor at age 41 of the most important AME church in the South, he was also a 4-term state senator, the youngest African American ever elected, still to this day, to South Carolina's legislature. So just a guy with a limitless future. But also a very, very much a human who, among other things, was spread very thin in his various responsibilities and was starting to get a lot of crap about it at Emanuel, including on the very night of his death. The book opens with a scene, or doesn't open with this, but the opening chapter includes a scene in which, at a business meeting, just an hour before this massacre takes place, he's subjected to this sort of humiliating rant by a church member who's dissatisfied with his absenteeism, not showing up for things, and it's done in front of his boss. So it really is sort of an embarrassing moment for him. I thought it was important to portray folks in their fullness and in 3 dimensions, and to portray the church the same way. In terms of how much of the violence to portray, I did draw some lines. There were things that I did not describe fully. But again, I think there's power in the brutality of what happened that night. And I didn't want to shade it. I sat through the trial, which took a couple of months, and for those of us who did, it wasn't like being in a war zone as a journalist or covering the aftermath of a horrific earthquake or something, but it was probably as traumatic a reporting experience as any of us had ever had, sitting in that courtroom, listening to the details, seeing the crime scene photographs and hearing about the ballistics and how many times people had been shot. Everybody had been shot at least 5 times. The eldest victim, 87-year-old Susie Jackson, had been shot 10 times. So, I thought that some of that needed to be said in order for people to really feel another real theme that courses through the book, which is just the persistence of this kind of racial violence, even generations after the successes of the civil rights movement.
So that chapter, the tragedy, it's difficult to read. As a journalist and a historian, how do you take care of yourself when you immerse yourself in violent, racialized history like this? What does self-care look like when your research requires you to sit beside that trauma you spoke of?
Yeah. Not very well thought out or practiced, probably. My wife would certainly say so. It's funny, there was, during the trial, I did a story for the Times about what the experience of sitting in the courtroom was like for family members of the victims, members of the church who knew all the victims, the pastor. It was a very emotional story to work on. But day after day through the trial, these folks would troop in and they occupied the right half of the courtroom, and they stayed all day and they listened to all of it and they absorbed it, despite how incredibly difficult that must have been to do. So I had arranged to meet the pastor outside the courthouse during a break. I was on deadline that day. We just had a few minutes to talk. I wanted to interview him for the story, and I asked him those questions about, how did he cope and what had the experience been like, and he finished giving me an answer, and then he looked at me and said, "But how are you doing? What's it like for you?" And I was really struck by the question because, I don't know, it's not that common, I guess, for a subject to care how the journalist is doing, number one. And number two, I just really hadn't thought about it. I had been sort of wrapped up in the job. And as I did think about it, I sort of concluded, I'm not sure I'm doing so great. Because like I said, it was pretty tough to sit through. And I don't know that I did take care of myself that well through the duration of it. The book took 10 years of almost nonstop steady work to produce, and I worked on it pretty much dawn to, I was going to say dusk, but my wife will remind me that it was way past dusk. It was after dinner, 9 or 10 o'clock at night most nights. So it was a lot of work. We moved to Charleston in 2022, so I was there for the last 3 years of the process, and I would take a break at least every afternoon at 5 or 6 o'clock and go take a walk for an hour. And it was just not only reviving because I was taking a walk, but it was fascinating because the place is the same. It has not changed much since the age of Emanuel's birth. And depending on, I live downtown, and whether I would turn left or right, I would inevitably walk past someplace I'd been writing about just that day. So that was pretty cool. I keep going back to her, but my wife has pointed out to me that she thinks that I'm noticeably lighter in spirit and attitude since I finished writing the book. And she doesn't attribute that just to the fact that the burden of writing the book is over. She attributes it to the fact that I'm not spending every day exploring this dark place.
Some people struggled with public forgiveness offered by the families. Did you come to see that forgiveness as liberating, complicated, or costly?
Yeah. Maybe all of the above. Let's talk about it for a while, and I'll give you guys a little bit of the backstory, because some may not remember. It's been a decade. The night after the shootings, there is a memorial service at Goose Creek High School where one of the victims, Sharonda Singleton, had taught and coached. And her 2 teenage children, Chris and Cameron, walk out of the service, and a British TV reporter thrusts a microphone in their face. Says, "What are you feeling right now?" And Chris, who's 19, I think at the time, incredible young man who went on to be a minor league baseball player and is now an inspirational speaker, pauses for a moment and says, "There's nothing but love from our side of the family. We've already forgiven him for what he's done." Right. The next day, there's a bond hearing. First appearance in court for the killer, the accused killer, who's been captured a day after the shootings in North Carolina on the run, brought back to Charleston. He appears. Family members are invited to come to the courtroom. No one is told in advance that they're going to be afforded an opportunity to speak. And they certainly have no real sense that this is being televised globally, as it was. But when the judge offers them that chance, 5 of them, one after the next, get up to the microphone and offer some expression of forgiveness for this then, as far as we know now, utterly remorseless white supremacist mass murder. I was watching it on TV. I think, like so many of us, I was simultaneously awestruck and befuddled at the same time, and certainly didn't know if I could have put myself in the same shoes. My questioning about it became an animating force in my research for this book. The epilogue of the book is totally devoted to this question of forgiveness and what it means in the context of hundreds of years of Black suffering and in the context of the Black church's efforts to ameliorate that suffering. And in interviewing each of those who forgave, I started to see consistencies. to a one, they all told me that it was totally unpremeditated, unplanned. They can't really even explain how the words came out of their mouths. Chris Singleton told me, if you had told me that I'd be forgiving the guy that killed my mom in the church because she was black, I'd say, no way in hell that would ever happen, and yet I know it had to be God because I still feel this way. They all describe it as this mystical experience. It was God talking, they were merely the vessels. Right? The other thing that they make clear is that the forgiveness was far less for him than it was for themselves. That it was a form of release, a form of relief. And as I started to think about it and sort of apply that notion to these centuries of oppression, injustice, mistreatment that African Americans have endured, it started to occur to me that, how else to get through? How else, as some of these family members told me, how else to put one foot in front of the other, to get out of bed every day without being so consumed by the toxicity, right? That you, and the rage and the fury and the frustration that and the propensity to respond with violence of your own. How else can you possibly get through unless you find a way to let it go? One of the family members of one of the victims, Anthony Thompson, who was himself a pastor and the husband of the woman who was leading Bible study that night, Myra Thompson, told me that what forgiveness had meant for him was that he didn't have to make a lifetime partner of this guy. Mm-hmm. He was able to let him go, put him in the past. Doesn't mean that he forgets. He remembers every minute of every day, but he is somehow able to move past. And so, in that way, to me, it felt like forgiveness as, in this context, and I think in the context of black history and the black church to some extent, going back generations, forgiveness really was a reclamation of agency. It was these folks saying to that killer that it stops here. You've taken my loved one, you've destroyed our community and our congregation, but you're not taking me. You're not going to take my ability to live out the rest of my life with purpose and mission and passion and joy. You're just not doing it. And so it was, in its own way, it's almost its own brand of resistance. There's a lot of resistance in this book. The word is in the title. Those who broke away from the white Methodist churches in 1817, they were resisting. Denmark Vesey, who plotted the slave revolt, resisting. Same thing with Richard Harvey Kane, the pastor who goes to Congress. B.J. Glover, the pastor who's leading marches from the fellowship hall and demonstrations during the civil rights movement, resisting. These folks, I think, in their own quiet way, were also resisting.
So the church was once linked to Denmark Vesey and insurrection. Nearly 200 years later, white supremacist violence returned to that same space. Did you see the massacre as history repeating itself or history reacting to itself?
Well, it's interesting. Let's talk about the Vesey revolt and what happened there a little bit. So, Denmark Vesey. Anybody? Have y'all heard of him? Anybody heard of Vesey? It's interesting. He's a historical figure who's known in some parts of the country and less so in other parts of the country. I think he's on his way to becoming better known nationally. Fascinating story. He was an enslaved man, enslaved obviously since birth, who was owned by Joseph Vesey, who was himself the captain of a slaving ship. Vesey worked on this ship throughout his adolescence and winds up in Charleston with Captain Vesey, after Vesey leaves his ocean-faring days and settles in Charleston. And Denmark Vesey becomes trained as a carpenter. There were enslaved people who were taught crafts, and sometimes even their work was contracted out. And through that contracting out, sometimes they would raise enough money to actually negotiate and buy their own freedom through manumission. That's not what happened with Denmark Vesey. He hit the lottery. He literally hit the lottery. He bought a lottery ticket in 1799. It was a lottery put on by the municipality to raise money for the extension of a road, and he wins. And he makes enough in prize winnings to buy his own freedom. Becomes a self-employed carpenter, makes a decent living, has some assets. He is a free person of color in a town that at this point has a pretty substantial population of free black people. He, despite his own freedom, is not satisfied because he's tried to free family members, tried to buy them out of slavery as well, his wife and several children, and is unable to, doesn't have a willing seller. This sort of radicalizes him, and he winds up, according to an extensive trial record that is under some questioning by historians over the last few decades, but the record shows that he was the central figure in plotting this, what would have been the most massive slave insurrection ever attempted on Southern soil, had it not been discovered, and he was basically given up to the authorities. There were mass arrests, nearly, I think, can't remember the exact number now, it's in the book, but I think over 100 people were arrested. 35 wind up going to the gallows. 35 men. One historian calls it the bloodiest sort of the bloodiest civilian jurisprudence, instance of jurisprudence in American history. 35 people hung, including Vesey. And the research I did showed that there was this remarkable connection to the church, that fully half of those who had been hung had some sort of direct tie to the church. And as I started looking at it, it really started to feel like it was the church itself that was under indictment here, that it was the church that the authorities were really concerned about. And in fact, the church is destroyed after that summer. Torn down board by board under order of the authorities. So I guess to answer your question, certainly the results were eerily similar in that yes, there was this explosion of violence in both cases, right? 35 men hung in one instance, despite not a single bullet being fired, not a neck being cut, right? No white man lost a drop of blood. 35 black men were hung, and the evidence in some case was pretty scant. Lots of evidence of pressure against witnesses to testify falsely against other folks to save their own lives, but 35 people hung, and then all these centuries later, 9 people killed in the fellowship hall. So it certainly demonstrates, as I said before, this persistence of racial violence over a long period of time.
Before writing this book, what do you think you understood about the Black church, and what do you understand differently now?
Yeah. Well, for a white guy, I had spent a lot of time in and around black churches over the course of my reporting career, and I kind of love telling the story of the first time that I walked into one, which was in 1980, what would it have been, 1980, when I was an intern for the Atlanta Constitution, summer after my junior year in college. And I became very good friends with a fellow intern, an African-American woman named Brenda Russell, who was from Alabama, studied at Harvard, needless to say, incredibly bright, very charming and poised. We became buddies. And we felt like we talked about everything, including race. And in the Atlanta of 1980, it was hard not to be talking about race. Among other things, this was the summer, one of the summers of the missing and murdered children slayings in Atlanta. And one day she says to me, you ought to come to church with me on Sunday. My Uncle Ralph was preaching. And I said, I'm thinking of ways to get out of this. I'm not coming up with a way fast enough, and before long I'm jotting down the notes, the directions to West Hunter Street Baptist Church. And anyone who knows a little Atlanta history, that's the giveaway to the end of this story, because when I walk in that Sunday morning and sit down with Brenda and her family in the pew and read through the program, I start to see that Uncle Ralph is Ralph David Abernathy. The iconic and rather imposing civil rights leader who was Martin Luther King's best friend and lieutenant and his successor as the president of the SCLC. And early in the service, Reverend Abernathy asked all the visitors to stand up, and we all do. And needless to say, I'm the only white face in the building. And then we all sit, he recognizes us, and we all sit down, and then he points a very long finger my way. And he says, no, you, back up. And I look around as hoping that he might be talking to somebody else, but he wasn't. And I stand up, and he just interrogates me. I mean, who are you, young man? Where are you from? Why are you here this summer? How do you know my niece? What are you doing for the newspaper? Where do you go to school? What do you study? History of what? And I'm just sweating. I cannot wait to sit down. He finally lets me sit down, and I'm sitting there the rest of the service thinking, what the hell was that about? Right? And maybe he was just bored after 30 years in the pulpit and wanted to have some fun, right? Maybe. But I know that what I took away from it, and still can remember the feeling, is that I felt that he wanted me to understand the feeling that all of his parishioners feel the moment they walk out of the safety of his church, right? Of being the minority, of being observed, of being judged, of being looked at, of being watched. I felt it, and it was quite a lesson that stuck with me. Anyway, long way to get back to your question. The other thing that happened that day was, I was introduced to the music and to the preaching style, to the sense of community and spirit that you only feel in a black church. And it was a revelation to me and a turn on. I really liked it, thought it was fascinating. And I kept coming back to black churches over and over again, not because I was covering them as a beat or anything, but because I would go looking for stories that intersected with them. So I eventually wind up with a full-time job at the Atlanta Constitution. It's just at the time that Atlanta's transitioning from white governance to black governance, and I wind up spending my days around the likes of Maynard Jackson and Andy Young and John Lewis and Julian Bond and Joe Lowry and Hosea Williams. And a lot of the politics of the city is taking place in black churches, right? When Barack Obama's elected president at the time sent me to Albany, Georgia, to do a piece about what that moment was like for the lions of the civil rights movement. Where did I go look for them? Church. Mm-hmm. And then in the year 2000, this actually predates that, obviously, the Times did a project called How Races Lived in America that looked at, tried to examine where the country was racially at the turn of the millennium, not by statistical study or looking at policy analysis, but by sort of embedding reporters in actual interracial relationships. Where'd I go? Church. I found an integrated Pentecostal church in the Atlanta suburbs and spent about 9 months immersed in the place, studying the ways that race affected the operations of the place. So, all goes to say that by the time this happened, I think maybe I had an uncommon appreciation for the place and power and role of the Black church, and I certainly felt the depth of the desecration that had happened that night. And in terms of whether the extent to which that's changed, those views have changed, I mean, I think I just have more of an appreciation for all of that, even as I recognize that the Black church, like all churches in this country, faces real challenges right now, of declining membership, and in Charleston it faces a particular problem of gentrification.
Wow, what an interesting story. How are we on time? Can I ask one more question? Okay. If someone reads this book 50 years from now, what do you hope they understand about Mother Emanuel that they may not see in headlines or memorials?
Well, I guess I go back to my initial point, which is, I want to make sure, I hope that they will understand that this church's history is about far more than one evening and the response of that evening. And that its history does reflect this incredible continuum of struggle by African Americans in the South, as experienced through this one incredible institution.
We're not quite there yet, okay? Just give us a few more minutes.
That was my last question.
I mean, I guess I'll add one thing to that, which is, and it's really a reflection on this time. I'm hoping it's not like this in 50 years. But, I couldn't have predicted what the political environment that this book would be born into. I started 10 years ago. But now that it is born into this environment, something that I feel very strongly about is that books like this, not just this book, but books like this, I hope will be seen now and in 50 years as an antidote to this kind of attack on our actual history, right? This book, I think, is the full and real history of African American life in Charleston. And these efforts that we're seeing both at the federal level and at many state levels to whitewash that history, to diminish it, to act like it didn't happen in some way, I think it couldn't be any sillier, and it couldn't be any more destructive to the common cause of building a national community in this country. My view is this is our shared history, and it needs to be recognized as such if we're going to make any real progress in this country. My people came here after the Revolution, after the Civil War. Doesn't matter to me, as far as I'm concerned. That's my American history, and so is this. And I hope that everybody will accept that.
So we're going to take questions from the audience, and then we will have some closing words from Ms. Janet at Source Books.
Yes, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Sir, I have 3 questions.
I'm trying to remember.
Sir, I have 3 questions, please. I appreciate your bravery and your courage. But my question to you is, what gave you the zeal for the story of this church? Why didn't a black man have the same zeal for the church, courage and bravery, and the zeal for this church, for the story? What gave you the zeal?
Well, I can't answer the last part, Others would have to speak for themselves, and I don't know that by any means that it means that there wasn't a black journalist or writer out there who wouldn't have or couldn't have done this book. But it was a book that I felt called to write. and felt that my entire career had sort of led me to write to some extent. I don't know that I could have written the book at any other point in my career. It was only after I had done the amount of reporting that I had, particularly about race in my native South, that I felt comfortable enough to take on this topic. Let's distill your question a little bit to its essence, which is, who's got the right to tell somebody else's story, right? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I assume that's to some extent what you're getting at, right? And I think it's a perfectly legitimate question. It's the right question for a book like. Yeah. Let me finish addressing that. Let me answer that first, because my view is that I went into this project with a lot of humility and sensitivity about the fact that I was a white man walking into a black church at this point in its history, when another white man had walked through the same doors and killed 9 people days before I arrived. I knew that there was a lot that I was going to get wrong, and there'd be a lot that I didn't understand at first, and more importantly than any of that, there'd be a lot that I would never be able to experience and feel the events of that night and the history of this place in the way that the people that I was writing about did. So I started off with an understanding of that, and I knew that I wasn't going to ever pretend to be anyone that I wasn't, or certainly wasn't going to write in a voice that wasn't mine. Every word in the book is mine. But I do feel like there were ways to counteract my shortcomings, mainly the way that I always do, which is to put in the work. So I interviewed 200 plus people. I spent 10 years at it. Spent a lot of time in the archives. I tried to shore up my weaknesses by just talking a lot and interacting a lot with historians and theologians, because I'm not a scholar, I'm a journalist. All that said, my answer to the question of who's got the right to tell somebody else's story is, as a journalist, I don't think there are necessarily limitations. I don't think that there should be restrictions or boundaries, things that I can't write about. If there had been, I don't know that I would have been very interested in the profession, because I know my backyard, if that's the only thing I can write about. And that's what journalists do. I mean, we travel in time and space and go to foreign lands and try to master the subject matter with enough depth and sophistication that we can report it back to our consumers at home with some trust and value to what we provide, and that's what I tried to do here. So, while I don't think that that just anybody is born with a right to tell somebody else's story, I think that professionals can earn that right by putting in the work. And I hope that's what I've done here. It's obviously up to readers, and particularly to the members of that congregation, to determine whether I fulfilled the promise or not.
And add to that, I hope you had a personal interest also to have that right to. And the second question is, sir, did you get any threats from the white supremacy for writing that story? Did you get any threats?
Nothing that's come to me. No, nothing that's come to me. I will mention, I did interact with Dylan Roof, the shooter. We exchanged letters from death row, where he continues to reside in Terre Haute, Indiana. I wrote him a couple letters. He wrote me a couple letters back. They were, as you might imagine, deeply disturbing. It was about 5 years ago, so I can't speak to his frame of mind now, but at that point he remained utterly remorseless and didn't seem to really understand that he had done anything objectionable.
I'm not sure it's worse. I'm sure he's saying that it's worse.
I'm sorry?
I said, I'm sure
Right.
I'm sure it works.
Right. And he has been lionized within the white supremacist community. There was a report put out a couple of years ago, I mentioned it in the book, I think by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks white supremacist and activity around the country and neo-Nazi activity around the country, and it revealed that there were insignia patches that had been made to mimic his bowl haircut. Yeah, that kind of thing. So.
We got other people. But he's next. We'll come back.
I'm sure we'll have time to come back.
I don't have a question, I have some comments. My name is Darwin Kirk from Port Detroit. I belong to the Metropolitan Area Church in Washington, D.C. And we have several connections to Mother Emanuel. His cousin Michelle belongs to my church, and she's married to a former pastor. Also, Mary Bennett, her grandfather was pastor of Emanuel. His picture's on the wall.
That's right.
And also, he came to my church about 3 or 4 years before he died. I was only usher on duty when he walked in. I said, oh, he's from Africa. And when he signed the register, I said, I know you're a state senator in South Carolina. He sounded very impressive. So we talked about being in church. He gave me his business card, which I still have.
How about
on my desk at home in Washington, D.C.
That's
I do it cool. Thank you very much.
That's a great story. Yeah, I've gotten to know the current pastor of Metropolitan a little bit, Reverend Lamar. Yeah, great guy, very impressive.
Got a question right here. Go ahead, ma'am.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Our church, Bethel A&E, right down the street from here, intends, well, some members intend, we've selected this book for our book club.
Oh, how wonderful.
We plan to discuss it.
Thank you.
And we're going to have to divide it up into manageable parts for us to discuss. But what I'm curious about, I looked at the copyright date, and I guess your publishing date was around the same, 2025?
Yes, ma'am,
This
June.
incident occurred over 10 years ago, right?
That's right.
All right. So your research has been continuous since that date?
I'm afraid so. No, I mean, you can tell from the story that I told earlier, I mean, I literally started thinking about this as I don't know if I was thinking about it as a possible book subject, but I certainly was thinking about it as a topic that merited broader attention than of just the shootings on the very night that it happened. I mean, I started right then and there. And in fact, I was on the Times' investigative team at the time, and it sort of wasn't my portfolio to parachute into a big breaking news story like this. I was off on some months-long project. But I was so interested and felt the pull that I kind of raised my hand and volunteered to go. I called my investigations editor and said, can I take a week or two off of my project? And they said, sure. And then I called our national editors and said, do you need an extra set of hands? And as always, the answer was yes. And got to Charleston a couple of days after the shooting, spent the first week writing a piece about Reverend Pinckney, a profile of Reverend Pinckney that ran on the front page of the Times on the morning of his memorial service, which is where we all remember President Obama saying Amazing Grace. And I got to go to that service and covered that for the Times as well, which was a special experience. So, yeah.
My name's Eric. So my family, my maternal side of my family came from South Carolina, a place called Sumter.
Sure.
In the 1940s.
Yep.
When they came here, they joined St. Stephen A&E. So my family is lifelong members of St. Stephen A&E. But I guess I haven't read the book, but the question is basically opinion, but does it discuss kind of the failure of, I guess, black churches to support or uplift the communities around them? Because at least where St. Stephen is, for a number of different reasons, the whole neighborhood fell apart over years. So just wondering if the book kind of discusses that at all. Thank you.
Maybe not quite on that point, but I do talk about a couple of related matters that I'll talk about real quickly. One is that I take a pretty hard and not always flattering look at the governance of the AME denomination, which has some interesting peculiarities. It's got an incredibly powerful hierarchy of bishops at the very top who are elected after expensive 4-year-long campaigns that almost resemble a presidential campaign. And once elected, they have incredible authority. They appoint all of the pastors and assign them to their churches on a 1-year contract so that they're able to shuffle people around, move them at will, depending on whether folks are on their good side or their bad side at any particular moment. And there's also been sort of a long history of financial scandal within the denomination. The most recent one being a couple of years ago with an enormous pension fund scandal in which tens of millions of dollars of pension investments seemed to disappear that ministers were counting on for their retirement. So I wrote about both of those things. And I felt like that was, again, part of trying to keep it real, that as long as I was spending 10 years within this organization studying it, I ought to talk about what I was hearing in the pews on a day-to-day basis, which was a lot of questions about how the church is run. The other issue affecting the churches in Charleston, and I don't know whether it's a factor in Detroit or not, I assume it's not, is gentrification. Downtown Charleston over the last 30 years or so, I mean, the real estate market's just gone crazy. Property being bought up by out-of-towners left and right, including me. I'm part of the problem. And as a result, property values have soared, taxes have soared, and African Americans of lower income have been forced out of these neighborhoods into less expensive parts of the community. Emanuel had very much been a neighborhood church. People used to walk or take a short bus ride to get there. Now, literally nobody can do that. I mentioned in the book that in my time there, the only people that I found who still walked to church were the white couple who joined the church after 2015. They had moved down from Boston, bought a nice townhouse downtown, been moved by the story of the church in the aftermath of the shootings, started to attend, felt welcomed, and joined the church. So those white folks are the only people that can walk to church these days. And Emanuel's got a particular problem because unlike other black churches in downtown Charleston, they can't make the choice to pick up and move to where their population is. Reason being that not only is it an active church now, but it's become a shrine. It's literally on the National Register of Historic Places. Tour buses pull up. The place attracts visitors on Sundays. So they can't leave, and they're going to have to deal with the demands presented both by a shrinking membership and some real infrastructural needs, all without having any sort of growth, any real growth in the congregation. It's a tough situation. Sir?
I'm just curious, is there anything that you learned about the nature of evil that you would want to share with us? Some insights.
He asked if I had learned anything about the nature of evil in the course of this. Like I said, I'm not a theologian or a scholar, but it's obviously the essential question here, right? And I did struggle with it. I think I may have entered this story unconvinced that evil existed as a force unto itself in the world, and certainly emerged more convinced that it might. I can remember having conversations with the lead prosecutor in the case during the trial, in which the whole component of the trial, I don't know if any of you will remember it, but the accused, I don't like to use his name very often, but the accused essentially sidelined his defense team, ambushed his own defense for the second half of the trial, which was the portion where they decide the sentence of life or death, for the very reason that he did not want it known, did not want the jury to know, did not want the world to have any feel that he had any sort of psychiatric shortcomings. The only way that his lawyers were to keep him off death row was to present some sort of psychiatric defense. And when he found that out, that that was their plan, he literally sidelined them and took over his own defense during the second part of the trial. There had been a series of competency hearings behind closed doors to determine whether or not he could do that. And during those hearings, there was some evidence presented about his psychological well-being or lack thereof, including some evidence that he had had a fairly long undiagnosed history of autism, which doesn't necessarily mean anything. Needless to say, there are plenty of autistic people, including plenty of autistic white supremacists, presumably, who don't take the next step, right? Go out and case out a church for 6 months, buy a weapon as soon as they turn 21, go into a Bible study and kill 9 people. But anyway, going back to the point, I can remember during that phase talking to the prosecutors about, well, you know, couldn't it have been this or couldn't it have been that that affected him, this about his childhood or that about his upbringing or his parents or whatever. And the prosecutor would I can remember saying, you know, Kevin, sometimes there's just evil in the world. Sometimes there's just evil in the world. And there may just not be any explanation for it. Sitting through the trial, I started to become more convinced. Certainly, reading this young man's writings, including his letters to me, made me more convinced.
Okay.
Just a quick question. You touched on it a little bit. How does somebody today go to the church and show respect but not be part of the tourism thing? How do you balance that?
So it's an interesting dynamic. I mean, I wouldn't discourage you from going as a tourist to visit the church on a Sunday morning. It's a wonderful experience, and visitors are welcomed. There is a bit of a divide within the church, although I hope that it's subsiding some. There's some people who think it's great that the church is filled up with visitors now. It physically fills the place up, it fills the plate up to some extent. And there are even people who say, you know, maybe this was the silver lining, maybe this was God's purpose that we didn't see. Hard to believe that it was worth 9 lives, but maybe the point here was to bring people into the church and expose them to our beliefs when they never would have otherwise. There are others, obviously, who just feel, you know, that's my pew that my family sat in for 4 generations, and why do I find white tourists in t-shirts and flip-flops in that pew on Sunday morning? So there's some tension there. So if you're in town, I would visit. There are also ways to give. The church has significant infrastructural needs. Like I said, there's an ongoing campaign to try to cure those. They need money. And there's a simultaneous campaign going on to build a beautiful memorial to the 9 adjacent to the church in what had been the parking lot that Dylan Roof pulled up into and parked in before he entered the open door to the fellowship hall. It's being designed by Michael Arad, who is the architect who designed the 9/11 memorial in New York. It's quite elegant and beautiful. It includes a reflective fountain lined with the names of the dead and some beautiful benches to sit on and reflect. The second phase is going to include a survivor's garden There were 5 survivors that night, 3 adults and 2 children. And there are 6 benches surrounding this survivor's garden. One's dedicated to each of those 5 individuals. And the 6th bench is dedicated to the ultimate survivor, Mother Emanuel herself. So certainly, those are 2 sources for donations, if that's the way you wanted to show your support.
May I ask a question, please? I love what you said about Black history is your history too. Unfortunately, not all Anglo-Americans feel that same way. So what do you say to them when there's this big debate going on as to whether or not Black history should even be celebrated in February or any other time of the year for that matter? But what do you say to your Anglo counterparts about Black history and its importance?
Just that, it's to me, it's so obvious. I mean, I think it's just delusional to try to segregate our history in the same way that we used to segregate our buses and our water fountains and our schools and our everything else. We are beyond this, and I think we're a big enough people to understand that even the most inglorious chapters of our history are nonetheless our real history. How else do we learn from it and move on? I think it's to me, it's such a statement of the obvious. It's hard to understand how there can be a movement in the other direction. But I recognize that there is.
And I hope that you will continue to spread your message, because you can talk to some people in a way that I cannot.
Yeah, well, I've gone out of my way to make this point every time that I talk about the book. I wrote an op-ed that ran in the New York Times, I think back in September, about the assault on the, specifically that we're seeing at National Park Service sites.
Yes.
And I visited some of the sites in Charleston, where obviously there's Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie. There's also a site that was the home of one of the Pinckneys, who was a signer of the Constitution, and one of South Carolina's signers. And they do a fantastic job of interpreting both sides of his history, both his important contributions to the Constitution and the fact that he was a significant slaveholder throughout his life. And so, you'll see one panel that talks about his trip to the Constitutional Convention, and next to it, an inventory of his holdings of enslaved people. That's good history. I'm not sure how much of that survives in that way, and it'll be tragic if it doesn't.
Thank you.
Okay. So Ms. Janet wants to say a couple words.
Okay. Hi, I'm Janet Webster Jones. I'm with my daughter, Callie Jones.
Come on over. Yeah.
Take a mic.
So I'm Janet Webster Jones. I'm the owner and operator and chief bottle washer at Source Booksellers, which is right down the street. This is my daughter Allison, whose work is showing here today by finding so many people to come. I wanted to thank Christine and Megan and Dennis is not here now. He helped get people here, and we wanted this event to be representative of the AME Church here in Detroit, Michigan. And I think, hold your hands up if you're a member of. Yes, because the history of the Bethel Church and the other AME churches is huge here in Detroit, and it deserves a book of its own about Detroit. I do want to say that when I first met this book, just having met Kevin Sack, but when I first met this book, I was absolutely thrilled and enchanted, first of all, with the cover, because the cover is a reflection of Charleston, South Carolina. And the insides took me to a place in my own development that I wanted to know more and more and more about the early beginnings of not only the Methodist Church, but as an Episcopalian growing up, that church as well. So the history of being Christianized in this country is right here in this book. And it's here for us to know. And there are many stories to be told. It happens, shifting a little bit, it happens that we are a member of a organization in the United States that is able to do donations. So these books are here today, and each of you will get a copy of the book for yourself.
Oh.
And hopefully we'll get some copies to some of the other churches that are represented as well. Allison, you want to say this?
So what we founded was the Source Booksellers Neighborhood Foundation. And so we try to take authors during the school year to schools and have books for children to have in their hand and meet a famous author. And this is another opportunity for us to help grow compassion for the church and the community and celebrate a book that our store is really feels that it's very important.
The other thing is that Source Booksellers was started with the idea of the adult reader. It took me a long time to bring children's books in, but it was the adult reader that I'm interested in, and I'm still interested in. So when I find these kinds of books, I know that they will expand the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of the adult reader. So we are happy to be able to offer this book to you today. Inside there's a little sticker that shows our foundation and the reason that we can give it to you. So we want to thank you very much.
That's just wonderful. Thank you guys so much for doing that. And since you mentioned it, I want to mention the cover real quickly. I wear this pin. Everybody see it? It's a sweetgrass pin, which is, sweetgrass is the closely associated, obviously, with the low country of South Carolina. And I wear it in tribute to my friend Jonathan Green, who's the artist who painted the image on the cover of the book. Do you mind showing it, Wallace? I love this cover. I don't know if any of you have heard of Jonathan, but he's a Charleston-based artist of some national and even international renown. He grew up in the Low Country, and he paints scenes of African-American life in the Low Country, including any number of church life. This picture was painted 30 years ago. But I had come across it in one of his books and loved it, and I thought it made for a great cover. So I really appreciate his contribution as well.
Okay, thank you so much. If you have more questions, Kevin will be here to sign books so you can have a conversation with him in person. So he's going to be seated right up there. And thank you so much for attending. Hopefully I'll see you.
Great questions, my friend. Thank you. Great response. I need you to sign my book before you leave, though.
Okay. All right. You got that?